Like, just to let you know, like, I'm just some dude in his room, came from an apolitical background. I just happened to, for some goddamn reason, read Capital, and I got into, like, Marx that way.
Oh yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah, that's the typical story.
Hello, and welcome to the 98th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Sunday, 9th of June, 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week, we talked to Kevin, Chris, and Jason of the Regrettable Century podcast about their experience spending 10 years in the Marxist sect, the ISO, before leaving a number of years ago. This follows on from an episode of their podcast where they talk about the recent demise of that organisation. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview. Part 2 will be the inaugural Patreon-only episode. So if you like what you hear, why not sign up as a patron for only $5 a month or $1 an episode. Speaking of patrons, this week I have the new patron Parker McQueenie to thank. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel and make sure to like, subscribe and share. You can also join me on Facebook or Twitter too. Okay, to the interview. I have a question for you guys. One is, how old are you? And two is, so 2 questions, and 2 is, how the hell did you get into the ISO?
This is Kevin. I'm 34 years old, and I joined the ISO back in Texas, where Jason and Chris and Jenny, who's also on the Regrettable Century podcast, had founded the chapter at the University of North Texas in a small town north of Dallas, Texas. The small college town up there where I had started going to school. So that's how I got into ISO.
Well, I'm Chris. I'm 37. And we actually Jason and I had been members of the ISO previous to moving to Denton. And when we got to Denton, we started an independent socialist group. And we ended up, I think, getting about 10, 12 members, something like that. And then deciding that we wanted to affiliate to the ISO just for the sake of having the resources of the organization. And we still pretty much, like for the most part, agreed with what the ISO stood for. So yeah, we did that. But the way we originally came to the ISO was just by going to anti-war protests. And I think this was probably like 2003. And they were probably the most organized and prominent people that was involved in the anti-war protests in Austin.
What size was the ISO, say, at that time?
Roughly, the figure of the ISO stays pretty static despite pretty constant recruitment for like that whole decade. There were like a few hundred people by around the time we happened across the group, because there was something of a collapse of the American left in hard numbers just across the board after 9/11, and like this whole, when the global justice, Ralph Nader, UPS general strike, abortive attempt at a Labor Party, all the stuff that kind of characterized the late 90s, that all came to a halt, with 9/11 and the Bush presidency. So by the Iraq War, their numbers are kind of swinging back up, but it's in like the low to mid hundreds. And by the time I left the group in 2015, there was about 800-900, and that number had been pretty solid for years by that point.
Right, I'd say the better part of a decade, they'd stayed right around 800 members.
So would that be one of the bigger sects in America at the time?
The biggest.
Yeah, by leaps and bounds at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
the biggest?
Yeah. I mean, the Socialist Workers' Party that had existed since the 1940s probably had about 80 people at the time. That would be the range, somewhere between 80 and 900, with the ISO being the only ones at the top end, at that time anyways.
Right, and I think that the DSA at that point, which I really don't know how they characterized their membership back then. I mean, how you could characterize their membership back then, because I know they've always had a lot of paper members. But they were probably bigger than us just because of the paper membership. And the CPUSA, also the same thing. Just lots of members that just sent in their dues and signed up on a piece of paper, and then you never heard from again.
Right, and very, very low dues as well, like an extremely low barrier to entry. Whereas, like, ISO, to be a member, it was like minimum $20 a month plus very demanding on your time, and they would like declare you not a member whenever you became inactive, sort of thing. Whereas, like, DSA or CPUSA, those probably had larger membership numbers, but it was something like $60 a year for membership dues, and then there's zero demand on you as an individual to be a member other than just paying your dues, period.
So how many hours a week are we talking here?
In the ISO? Oh, man. Well, let's see. We had our weekly meeting, which was supposed to be 2 hours, but often ended up longer than that. And then we always would go out afterwards, and it was, under the guise of hanging out, but it was really trying to recruit people that we invited out to hang out with us afterwards. So that was about, 4 hours on a Thursday night, plus we had our fraction meetings, which would be whatever movement work we were involved in, and you had to be involved in one. And generally, those meetings would be the same amount of time spent, like 2-3 hours. And then you would have to organize. You would have pre-fraction meetings where you would meet with the other people that were in your fraction about the interventions you were going to make in your fraction work. So that's probably another hour on top of that. On top of the once a week paper sales that we did, which were about a couple hours minimum. And that was the minimum that you were supposed to do, is once a week, sometimes 2, 3 if you could. On top of that, if you were in leadership, like pretty much all of us were in and out of leadership the whole time we were in the branch. You had other committee meetings. I don't know. I'd say like a pretty good average would be a minimum of like 15 hours a week spent in the ISO, like doing ISO stuff.
Yeah,
that's like a part-time job where you had to pay to do it. It's a real proper sect. I mean, by comparison, at the time, and even today still, the DSA, you count as a member if you pay dues once, and you can be arrears in dues for 2 years, I think, before you're taken off the rolls. And you don't ever have to show up to anything once in your whole tenure as a member. So, like some pretty huge extreme polar opposites when it comes to like what it means to have an organization.
How long did you guys stay in it then?
Too long. I joined the ISO in 2004, and I formally kind of left at the sort of the end of 2015, but really kind of dropped out of activity. It kind of went on like a hiatus, sabbatical, whatever, in like 2014. It's about 10 years in real terms, 11 years, I guess.
It's about 9 for me.
I think about the same length of time as the two of y'all, maybe a little bit short, because I think y'all were in ISO before I joined it, but I think I was drifting away around the same time as y'all.
Before we go any further, just back to the paper sales, how many papers would you sell in a few hours? Like, would people actually buy them?
That's a really good question. I remember it was rare when I had a paper sale without selling a single copy of it. And sometimes we would probably sell a good handful when there's like, the start of the semester and new students are showing up and they're like, oh, what is this? And they'll come up and talk to you and buy a paper just to sort of like for the novelty of it,
I think that the most we ever sold at one time was about 40. And that was right. I don't remember what was going on at the time, but it was during the Obama election when, Fox News and everyone else it was the first Obama election in 2008. When everyone was calling Obama a socialist in the conservative media. So you had the buzz about socialism was out and around for the first time in a very long time. So you had people who were just like, socialism, sure, that's what the guy that I'm voting for is being called. So I guess, sure, I'll check it out. And that was probably there were about 3 or 4 paper sales in the middle of, like right before the election, where we sold 20, 30, 40 papers, but generally we'd sell about 5, 6 at most.
Yeah, it would always be kind of heightened, like be greater numbers whenever there was something like really significant happening in the moment. Like I remember when the IDF launched a kind of a semi-invasion into Lebanon, and Hezbollah beat them back, and like that day that it was in the news, we had like a milk crate. This is in Austin, Texas, so this is like, 2006? He had like a milk crate set up on the street corner, and we had like protest signs, and we kind of had like a buzz around it.
Right in front of John Cornyn's office, I think
Yeah,
it
because
was,
he was
right?
a senator from Texas who was like, like every senator in the United States, big pro-Israel guy. And, at moments like that, you would be like every single person walking by would be interested in talking to us, and a couple of people would buy papers. Or like during Occupy Chicago, we would just like hold up a newspaper and somebody would walk. We wouldn't even have to talk to them. They would just walk up and want to buy it. The presumption, of course, is that each paper sold is a contact's name written down and a potential relationship to establish. But really, the reality is that like selling the paper often just meant, well, now the paper's sold. And because when you have like so much pressure to do it, the actual function, like the whole thing it's supposed to do, which is facilitate a conversation, really it kind of gets sidelined.
Right.
How would it get sidelined?
Well, I don't have like a really scientific way to approach it, but it seems to me, just from reflecting backward, that because the desired result is a sold paper and a contact signed and a future arrangement to like meet up and talk politics, the easiest one in that situation is to just put the newspaper in somebody's hands. And so that's the one that you end up kind of focusing the most on. And, whenever you have some kind of person in a position of junior leadership or whatever who's trying to make an assessment of how well the branch is doing, one of the healthiest indicators of a branch supposedly is sold papers. So you get this very like planned economy under Brezhnev kind of like, meet the targets and like order more papers and sell more papers.
Yeah.
And presumably that just makes the conversations happen. But the political training wasn't really such that the papers sold equated to contacts made. Not really.
So do you want to guys go through why you ended up leaving?
I think I left the sect first. I was in graduate school at the time. And, it's very hard to find time to do anything when you're in graduate school. And I was taking a full graduate course load on top of foreign language courses that were extra, and was incredibly stressed out about everything at all times, and going through a divorce, which was interesting. But I was showing up to these meetings, and it was during our pre-convention season, where we were discussing the things that are going to happen, the things that we're going to vote on at the convention. And it seemed as though the new positions that the ISO was taking on a bunch of issues, namely among them being the orientation that we were going to take towards issues of identity politics, were sort of being just very cynically changed, like all of a sudden, where we had taken the position for years and years and years that we were not feminists and identity politics are bad. You didn't need feminism because you had Marxism, and Marxism is already feminism scored, so you didn't really have to worry about the whole inclusion of a separate thing called feminism. They just sort of did an about-face on all of those things. They're like, oh, well, actually, now we're going to take issues of identity. We're going to talk about those more. We're going to rewrite some of the books that we wrote, castigating these ideas and, I guess backwrite them to make them just put a better face on things. It just seemed like a very cynical kind of manipulative way to change the way that the ISO looked from the outside without really doing anything to address the concerns of people who were attracted to identity politics in the first place. So it seemed really cynical and really sort of just like, well, we'd better change the drapes so that the facade looks a little bit better, and we can continue to keep drawing people into the organization. And that was kind of disgusting to me, and I just kind of fell out after that.
Who would make this decision to just totally change stuff and actually rewrite whole books?
They put it to us all in the form of resolutions that everyone would vote on, but the way that these kind of sects work is that the people at the top, their opinions have an enormous amount of weight, so that any positions that are coming from the steering committee are almost always just going to be like rubber stamped through. And that's basically resolutions were coming out of the central committee, the steering committee, about the way that we were going to change our orientation and the way we wanted to change our orientation. And there was, a pretty good amount of justification written in these resolutions, and we would all talk about them. And of course, with very little real debate on the subject, things just kind of got pushed through.
Well, yeah, specifically because organizationally, you move ahead. you gain status and position in the organization by parroting the official line on things, which the official line is whatever the leadership body says it is. And if you cause any problems by not towing the party line, then you get sidelined. Organizationally, you get squeezed out. So it created this internal culture of sort of organization-wide posturing, of individuals posturing, members posturing for each other to demonstrate how much they adhere to the party line. And it did not create an atmosphere where dissent of any sort was ever tolerated or permitted. There wasn't ever any real discussion of issues. It was just like sort of rehearsal and practice by members, like, how well am I articulating the party line here? And people sort of trying out ways of repeating what they've been told to adopt. For me personally, that was a major part of why I drifted away over time. I felt like, similar to Chris, I had the core group of us back in Texas who were making ISO function back there had all sort of moved away to different things going on in our lives, different jobs or grad school. I moved to Portland, Oregon to go to law school. I was in law school, and so that took up a lot of my time. I wasn't able to be as involved in ISO out here, but I was still a member. But just over time, without being as actively engaged in it, I found that I was just increasingly frustrated with the divergence between what the organization claimed it valued, such as freedom of debate and democracy and engagement with the real world and finding and meeting people where they actually were, versus the actual practice of the organization where debate wasn't actually tolerated, where there was just a dogmatic sort of repetition of the party line, no matter what the real world conditions were, no matter where the rest of people that I was engaging with in the world were actually functioning. And I just got tired of being in basically like a little study group that was reading the same books over and over and over again. And I was like, I've read these. Thanks for the education, guys, but this just isn't a good home for me anymore. I wanted to be able to engage in a world that seemed to me outside of ISO to be increasingly hospitable to the ideas of Marxism and socialism. Meanwhile, ISO, I felt, maintained its position of being isolated and sort of turning away from the rest of the world.
That's more or less the way I would sum it up too. I mean, I think the first thing is that, like, in most cases we're talking about social pressures that are informal in terms of the dynamics of, like, officially you're allowed and encouraged to debate, dissent, argue things out, but informally it actually really matters that you don't do it too much. My own experience is similar to Kevin's, especially that, like, during the last few years, really ever since Occupy Wall Street, I had been more and more kind of convinced that the world around us was changing and opening up and becoming more hospitable. And in my mind, the purpose of a cadre group was always to prepare for the opening and then to kind of like melt into whatever larger formations there were in order to like help provide leadership or whatever delusions we had. And then, you'd have Shama Sawant, the first elected socialist in Seattle, and then the Bernie Sanders moment, and just sort of different things that indicated over the years, like, oh, I really have it right here, that the group has outlived its usefulness, no matter however generous you might be about, what its function was in the 1980s and 90s, darker times for socialism. And then, the group collapsed under the weight of all kinds of internal inefficiencies and contradictions, and we've seen that happen with the SWP in the UK and a bunch of other places. So I don't know, it's kind of sucks to be right, but on the other hand, it kind of feels good because life inside a sect is terrible.
It's pretty toxic.
Yeah, I'm still unlearning everything I was trained to think and do.
In these votes that you would say would come down, were they open votes or were they private votes?
There was an annual convention where each branch or whatever would have delegates being sent to the convention, and there would be open votes for everything.
In every branch meeting and every convention, in every setting where there's a vote, it was always a show of hands.
Yeah. It was done the Robert's Rules of Order method of voting and with a visible show of hands.
So that's obviously pretty toxic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out.
It turns out. So I'm surprised, guys. How did you last that long? It's 10 goddamn years.
I know. Well, for me, this is actually, so Jason earlier made the point that the ISO really existed in Texas because there was a sort of a core of people making it, a core of us really making it exist. We were kind of isolated in a sort of desert, and we made the ISO where we were a lot more inclined toward the realities of like openness and democracy and taking votes and, as a group following the dictate of the vote, whatever the vote is. And it was a bit more of a healthy environment, I think, because the core of us were running it. And then when we all sort of scattered to the winds, subsequently, it no longer was that for us. I think partially for me, I was in it so long because I felt the weight of the rationale that is, I cared a lot about the world, and I cared a lot about my sort of ideas about how change happens, and I felt the weight of the duty, the obligation to do my part in trying to make the world a better place. And I didn't see a better alternative that existed because, like somebody was saying earlier, ISO was the biggest Marxist organization that really existed at that time. And I kept convincing myself that, maybe there's these flaws in this organization, but if we organize well, we can organize to improve this organization. It proved itself to not be open to reforms, though.
Yeah. The question was how and why did we last that long? And I think it's a good one. At the time, for a long period, for all of my adult life until I left the ISO, I was just very much a true believer. I guess, over there you encounter these people sometimes. They also have a newspaper called Socialist Worker, and you talk to them and they've got really well-rehearsed arguments and political line. But I was always also a dissenter in the sense that I always kind of thought that because I was a true believer and thought the group was healthier maybe than it was, that there was always an opportunity and a space for it to become a better version of itself. And everywhere I looked around, I would encounter people in smaller, weirder, less intellectually curious, more dogmatic groups that were also just, super off-putting. And I every single time I thought, what does life outside this group look like? And it looked like either not being active in anything, or at least not in an environment in which class was a part of the discussion. Because this is a hard thing to kind of, I think, to really explain to people outside the U.S. is that you didn't even hear the word class, even in like left activist, anti-globalization, anti-corporate, anti-whatever movement spaces. You wouldn't hear class come up. And if it did, it was like, don't talk about class. Like that's like, there wasn't a space for that.
Even socialism was taboo. You could talk about being anti-capitalist, but if you said the words like socialism was taboo.
Yeah. Right. And it really took, actually for me, I left the States for a while. I got rid of everything I owned. I bought like a one-way ticket to Europe, and I worked and whatever. That's not the important thing. The important thing is I encountered people on the European left in different countries. And I got a real sense that I actually come from a terrible, toxic, narrow-minded, very low horizons movement. And that's when I formally left.
For me, it was just that it really was the best of the left in the United States at the time. It was like the other organizations that we would come across would be, Orthodox Trotskyist organizations who were so dogmatically Trotskyist, and they would quote Lenin and Trotsky and Marx the way that Christians quote Bible verses, like evangelicals quote Bible verses, and it just seems so strange and just wow. At least we know how to relate to people, and compared to them, we did.
Yeah.
The other groups were Stalinist groups and Maoist groups who were just, by comparison, just insane. We seemed really healthy compared to the rest of the American left.
Or anarchist and just totally incapable of accomplishing anything.
Right, which, I mean, yeah, absolutely. There was that. And, it always seemed like things would get better. When the organization would be growing, we'd have a lot more people at our yearly conference, and it would seem like things were starting to open up, and we would have people from different organizations representing their organization at our conference, and I was like, oh, I can see a point where sometime in the near future we're going to like throw this thing wide open and start making open alliances with other socialist groups, and maybe we can actually get to the point where we're talking about forming a workers' party one day, But then the longer I stayed in it, the more I saw it as just a cycle of
rinse and repeat.
Right, exactly. Like I felt that the best of the organization was on display at Socialism, and if you could make it through Socialism Conference is what it was called, and if you could make it through to the next Socialism Conference, it would help like rinse away the demoralization and give you the fortitude to make it through to the next one. And that got old. But really, I mean, I was a true believer. I was a total Cliffite, but I had a bunch of suppressed tendencies that I had left over from just my upbringing that were sort of butting up against my Cliffism, that eventually I was able to let loose once I quit the ISO, and I'm very happy about that.
So explain to me what you mean by you were a true Cliffite.
Before we do that, can I add one more comment about sticking around, just to balance this a little bit, because one of the things, and I think this is probably generally true for people, not just from the ISO, but probably more generally people who have dedicated a lot of their lives to a small socialist group, is that we were instrumentally involved in things that did matter.
Yes, that is true.
There are people who, innocent people saved from death row, not entirely, but partially due to contributions made that were organized through the group I was in. It recruited me and introduced me to my first trade union and brought me to my first picket line to support another union. Real world struggles were real, life and death battles where people's lives can be improved or can be degraded on the basis of the outcome. Those were the kinds of things that I think really actually kept us involved.
Yeah. That's
really in defiance
point.
of the environment, of the closed group environment. It was the outward connection to things that really mattered. And I think that's important, first of all, to be generous to ourselves, but second, to understand that it wasn't until that became more generalized across the country that it became so easy for people to break from the sect. Because, now I can be involved in things that really matter as a socialist in an open way with organization, with other people, but it also is healthier and feels good, because all those ingredients together were necessary, I think, to really shatter this thing.
So who said they were a true Cliffite? Was that Jason?
No, it was Chris. That was me.
Chris, sorry. So the voices are so similar.
All Americans
literally,
sound the
I can't
same.
tell the difference. Well, yeah, it's true. No, well, like I tell Kev because he kind of, he's got an Irish name. There's probably still a slight bit of like, I don't know where the fuck the K's from, I don't know, Tipperary or something. Sorry, but do you want to talk about the Cliffite thing and what you mean by that? Because a lot of people who aren't in the sect world, they might have heard of Tony Cliff, but they don't know what that means. Okay,
you can sum up the basis of Cliffite Trotskyism or third camp Trotskyism with the neither Washington nor Moscow slogan. So the Cliffites believe that the Soviet Union was a state capitalist economy and a bureaucratic dictatorship, and it did not represent socialism at all after, it depends on who you talk to within the organizations, but after some point in the 1920s. And that socialism must come from below and must be organized, and socialist economy and the socialist government must be organized from below. So if it's not a system of workers' councils, then it's not socialism. There are a bunch of sort of peripheral positions that the Cliffites take as well. But I would say that those are the major ones. Really, that China is not socialist, Cuba is not socialist. Really, there was only the first few years of the Russian Revolution were the only place that you could look to as an example of true socialism. Would you guys say that's right?
I think.
How about Spain? What do you say on Spain?
I think the official line on Spain was a aborted revolution that was ultimately, obviously, it was the fascists' fault. But second to the fascists would be the communists for breaking up working class organization. And then third in line for blame was the anarchists for having working class organization and hegemony, but an unwillingness to like take and wield power. And then fourth in line for blame would be all the other non-Trotskyist independent socialists who, and whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's what they would say.
The POOM for breaking with Trotsky prematurely, because you're not supposed to have broken with Trotsky until 1940.
Until 1940. Yeah, it's not. First of all, it's not until after Trotsky's dead.
That's when you break with Trotsky.
Importantly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's funny. I was going to say it's just like the way that these groups have the way that they act toward their existing leaders. So Trotsky's a defender of the USSR in a sort of critical way up until his death.
He refers to it as a degenerated worker state.
And so then after he dies, and after the Second World War, and when the Cold War sets in, and rather than being shaken and reformed or changed in some way by the experience, the Soviet Union under Stalin just kind of this is in the Cliffist, the IS view, the International Socialist Tendencies view of things, extends its power across Eastern Europe. And it is able to even be replicated independently in places like China and whatever, that it proves itself to be a new kind of class society rather than a kind of weird liminal space in between. The way that Trotsky described it, it would be like either it would fall backward into full-fledged capitalism, or it would have to roll forward into, healthy working class control, true socialism. But at some point it becomes obvious that it's a society that is... It is challenging global capitalism for power, but is not producing what it is that socialists have historically fought for. And so it's obviously a new development of a kind of class society that I guess they landed on state capitalism, but there was a debate about, is it a new class society? Is it just capitalism with like a bureaucratic sort of collective ruling class above it, But essentially, that's the new thing that defines the like post-Trotskyist or the post-Trotsky Trotskyism.
It sort of evolved out of the bureaucratic collectivism versus degenerated worker state debate, and ends up with state capitalism being a nice, clean, easy way to sum up what the Soviet Union was to the Cliffites, and that would have been where the state takes on the role of capitalist exploiter and extractor of surplus value instead of the individual firms or private capitalists.
I want to say this too, that I could see why this might have mattered a lot to people in the 1950s or in the 1980s even. I can at least I can rationalize it. But I remember, in the 2010s encountering people that would ask, like, why does this matter anymore? And the kind of answer that we would have, which would never really felt satisfactory, was, well, because, it's about this is about the kind of world we want to see, right? So we don't want to be partisans for this particular set of mistakes and errors or whatever. And looking back, that's such a profoundly idealist way of understanding things. Like, oh, I imagine it to be something that could be good instead, and so therefore it will be. Like that distinction of the kind of Trotskyist you are really it becomes utterly meaningless in the wake of the, from the 1990s onward, at least. That's the way I see it now.
How did you guys square the circle of this idea of socialism from below when the party was the exact opposite in reality?
What we call it is intellectual gymnastics.
Cognitive dissonance, I think.
It's called casuistry, I believe.
But seriously,
right.
Did you never sit down together and go, lads, what's going on here?
Well, I mean, the facade of democracy was there, you could make whatever intervention you wanted, and you could get it you could get a proposal seconded and turn it into a resolution and put it forward, and it looked democratic from the outside. There was a very healthy culture of laughing away criticisms of rule by force of personality or anything like that.
Like a black humor.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be like, oh yeah, if you think that the ISO is guilty of groupthink or, rule by force of personality, just come to one of our conventions and see how divisive and fractious and, sort of just argumentative the thing could be. I mean, so it kind of did look like from the outside, like it was democratic. But if, being removed from it, hindsight is 2020, I could definitely see how it absolutely was not. And we wanted to believe that it was democratic, so we did.
Well, compared to the actual amount of participation that a person is used to in like civil life in the modern Republican society like ours, it was, like it did actually encourage you to do and think and to take ownership of things relative to your actual life, where participation is limited to a very narrowly defined set of like sort of pseudo choices every 4 years or so.
Right, like we don't have like the chaps who fancy pigeons like get 2 votes and have representation in parliament, we have nothing like that,
That's what's missing. That's what's
Right.
missing.
The thing that it did is it encouraged you, to kind of step out of the confines of the way that you were trained to think about your engagement with the world, by the society. But the problem is that it couldn't then deliver on. It's kind of like the way that when I was a child, my mother was like a very strict, super conservative Christian, but also wanted me to go to the library all the time. And at a certain point, those two things kind of butted up against each other, right? It was like I started developing ideas outside of the framework that I was allowed to have them. And so my experience inside of a sect is pretty similar to that inside of a church as a child.
It's funny you should mention that, because I've written down one thing here just when we were chatting. It feels to me like when I hear you guys talking about it, it feels like the way you talk, how I kind of felt after like I became an atheist. You feel like you've lost religion.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate description of how you feel about those 10 years?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of having a crisis of faith and having had to sort of recalibrate or, whatever, think about things in new terms. But no, in the sense that I don't think I consider myself an atheist anymore, like I did when I was a teenager and in my 20s or whatever. And I actually think that my religious upbringing has been the roots of my kind of humanism, of my, even what attracted me to socialism. It's all stuff from the Bible. I don't adhere to any particular faith now, but I just think having been taught to think in certain ways, it hasn't really left. And I feel the same way about having been a part of this small, weird, increasingly weird organization. It's like, there's certain things I think will always be there. So it's not a full rejection in the way that I think atheism would be.
Right, yeah. I was going to say similarly, I can make the comparison very directly in my own life, because I was raised in a very, very strictly fundamentalist Christian Protestant home. And I went through a process of, losing my religion, losing my faith, and leaving Christianity. That was a much more fundamental break for me, where I totally fundamentally reevaluated my entire worldview, the way I understood the world and myself and my place in the world, my relation to it, how I understood what was right or wrong. Everything was just completely, utterly revolutionized, top to bottom. Whereas, sort of having this break with this organization that I was wedded to very closely, like Jason said, mirrored it in some ways, but the similarities were more, I think, in the loss of a connection to a sort of a social connection to other humans that were affiliated with this organization, loss of a sense of orientation in a sort of dizzying map of political ideologies that exist. But it wasn't the sort of existential crisis that loss of religion was for me. I still broadly operated in the world along the same political values and that sort of thing. I just sort of lost connection to a very specific political organization, So I suppose it's similar, but much, much more narrow.
Yeah, my loss of faith was traumatic for me. I didn't like it. I didn't like that I couldn't believe in God anymore whenever I first left the church and became a militant, annoying atheist. But like, I have since become something else that doesn't really have a label for it. I guess you could probably figure out a label, but I don't want to talk about that really. But
are you a follower of the Elohim? Is that what we're saying?
No. No, I would say that like my views of whether or not God exists and stuff like that are, very non-theistic and somewhat amorphous, but I don't really know. I don't really have like a solid view of what I think about spirituality and whatever else. It's definitely not militant.
I don't believe
atheism.
in God, but I do believe in the devil.
No, but what I was saying is that like having left the ISO, I mean, I didn't quit being a true believer in the emancipatory power of the working class to free itself and humanity from the chains of class society or anything like that. I just kind of got very nihilistic about whether or not I cared, like I was like, this is just, it's too much, and I don't really think I have much of a place in this. And so I'm just going to go my own way for a little while. And it wasn't like a world-altering thing like Kevin said. It was just more like, maybe I'll fit myself back into this puzzle somehow in the future, but as for right now, I'm just going to go solo.
Yeah, I've a little story to tell you. It's just on the point you were making about the House of Lords or something. There was one lord, and I don't think he'd ever turned up, and he was just an Irish guy. And obviously his family must have fallen on hard times through the years, and he was working as a butcher in a small town in Ireland, and he was officially he was a peer of the British Empire. He was like, should have been sitting in the House of Lords.
Oh,
I think he was actually getting paid, and he'd never gone. And he was just literally just a guy working in a butcher's shop until like Tony Blair reformed the House.
That's incredible.
In like 1997 or something, and your man lost his seat. Just like he didn't have a posh accent. He was just like some country bumpkin like myself or something,
That's amazing. Also, it never even occurred to me that Tony Blair did something good.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening. Please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network's sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.